Good morning, good evening, hello from wherever you are. So, my name is Dolphin Magero. We'll be sharing the Global Climate Action Fund institutional proposal. We take this opportunity to apologize for not being able to uh, present this particular proposal in the scheduled time. We had a bit of logistics and technical issues, but we will be proceeding with sharing the proposal at this particular moment. So, welcome and have a seat, and let us unpack what an institutional fund proposal would entail. So, a bit of background information. At the 14th Conference of Youth, young people convened to discuss how they would sort of uh, prepare on meaningful engagement at the 24th Conference of Parties. This was at the University of Silesia. And one of the key outputs was the Global Youth Policy Position paper that was presented to the COP24 presidency at the end of the 14th Global Conference of Youth. So it captured key aspects of adaptation finance, mitigation, and a couple of issues. So within the Talanoa dialogue section, the aspect of youth financing and climate uh, finance and youth engagement came up. So it was realized it was critical to provide financing for young people, especially in light of the Global 2023 Stocktake and the Global 2028 Stocktake. In June of 2020, a coalition of youth organizations began an initiative to capacity build young people on climate finance and carbon pricing. This was because uh, in 2020, because of the COVID pandemic, there was no COP and there was momentum had gone down on climate change, and there was need to keep up the momentum on climate change and climate finance discussions. This was also based on the fact that the next COP, which was scheduled for 2020, was supposed to be a finance COP, which was supposed to check whether the international community had met the $100 billion target to be able to the $100 billion target that would, of course, be able to support developing countries to meet their adaptation and mitigation needs. So this initiative birthed the Global Youth Climate Action Fund initiative. So the conceptualization of the initiative was championed by BLI Global and Drop Access and had gone on for the better part of 2020-2021. At the end of 2021, the concept of a youth fund institution came into being, and this is what we are here and we're seeking to unpack, and how you as young people could be part and parcel of the institution basically. So before we move on to the institution, we want to try and unpack the concept of youth in climate finance, look at the rationale, try to express in terms of mathematical expressions the concept of youth and climate finance. So when you look at this particular concept, we call it the economics of youth climate change. Not that it's real economics, it's sort of trying to understand how young people could potentially fit in logistically in mathematical sense. Looking at definition of sustainable development, it's development that seeks to meet the current generation without compromising the ability of generation from meeting their needs. So therefore, current generation would, of course, which is the older generation, uh, would be the numerator to the younger generation, because the population of the younger generation is going to be higher than the population of the older generation. So in a graph of y is equals to mx plus c, y would be the younger generation, x would be the older generation, m would be the needs or the drivers of the current or older generation, and c would represent climate and environmental finance. It is only within the youth demographic uh, that this particular agenda would be possible, because when you look at the youth, youth is a cross-cutting cohort. We have youth in government, youth in civil society, youth in private sector, youth in faith-based organizations, youth across every cohort, youth even in private sector. So youth is a cross-cutting cohort of young people. The case scenarios. So we'll explain four case scenarios. So the first case scenario is when y is equals to 0. With the equation of y is equals to mx plus c. When y is equals to 0, it simply means that there are no younger generation. It means that our parents did not give birth to us, so we did not come into existence basically. So within this particular mathematical sense, then mx, meaning the needs of the current generation meeting their needs, would be equal to the climate or environmental finance that we require. So they would not be there would not be a need to source for environmental or climate finance. So this is very unrealistic because the fact that we young people still exist, still breathe, it basically means that this is an impossible situation because we already have come into existence. So this case scenario is impossible and it negates the Rio at Summit conference of 1992, which produced the Brundtland report. So it negates or rejects the whole concept of sustainable development. When we come to case scenario 2, when x is equals to 0, x represents the older or current generation. When x is equals to 0, mathematically y is equals to c. So it basically is a situation where there are no older generation. So when there are no older generation, it means the equation is null and void because the younger generation will also not exist. So that whole equation becomes null and void and becomes obsolete, or in other words, impossible. Moving on to case scenario 3, long-term finance scenario when C is equals to 0. C represents the value of climate or environmental finance. So when you say C is equals to 0, it basically means we do not need climate or environmental finance. We do not need to address the impacts of the environment. It basically means that Y is equals to mx, which means that the development needs that, of course, the older generation have set will be sufficient to last the younger generation for the rest of eternity. So the 2030 goals, it basically says that when we get to 2030, we do not need any further 2060 goals or 2040 goals, or when we get to sustainable development goals, we do not need to set any more goals and priorities when that time comes. When young people step into the decision-making stage, we will not need to formulate policies or set goals or set targets that support development and environmental protection. This goes against the principle of environment and sustainable development. It basically means that whatever the older generation have done or are doing will be sufficient to cater for the needs of the next generation. It basically, in very close, bring it closer to home, it basically means that if a farmer father has planted beans in his farm, it basically means that the beans, the the son of the farmer will not need to plant again, basically, because the beans planted for the farmer by the farmer father will be enough to cater for the son when he gets to maturity and until he dies, basically. So this is not an ideal and it's also a very impossible situation. Then we have case scenario 4, when m is equals to 0. When m is equals to 0, it means that there are no development plans, there are no development agenda. It basically takes us to the Stone Age period before man discovered fire. So it basically depicts a picture where man stayed the way he was. We lived in cages, we did not discover fire, we did not cook food, we let things, they did not interfere, we did not have any push factors basically to advance where man did not evolve. So case scenario 4 symbolizes a lack of evolution basically. So this is also an impossible situation. So when you come and look at the economics of youth climate finance, basically finding the true value of M. Why is M very important? M is extremely important because M is the driving factor. What drives the current generation to conduct activities that deteriorate or harm the environment that cause us to need that later creates the need for environmental and climate finance. So M is the cause factor for climate change issues and environmental degradation. So what is this true value of M? When you look at our table, we have arranged in the first column corresponding conference of parties, years passed since the first conference of parties, year to 20 years left to 2030, then the true value, then the exact corresponding year. So when you look at COP26, it coincides with 25 years that have passed since the first COP. It's supposed to be 26, but one one year uh, was 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 captured by the COVID pandemic, so it becomes obsolete. So at that particular time, we had 25 years of climate change discussions and negotiations, and at that particular time, we had 10 years left to the impacts of climate change becoming irreversible, according to the IPCC 1.5 special report. And what is the value of M? It was at 2.5. When you look at the column of the true value of M, it seems to be on an upward trajectory up to 2030, basically. So up to 2030, it means that the drivers and the forces that cause us, the human beings, to go out and conduct activities, actions, initiatives that deteriorate or harm the environment and trigger climate change, basically, are going to increase because they are going to have increasing population. It also means that also the impacts of climate change are getting worse and worse by the day. And at 2030, it will be more worse. Basically, it will be extreme cases because the IPCC reports indicate that by 2030 the impacts of climate change will become irreversible, basically. So the true value of M has a direct correlation to the value of C, which we saw was climate or environmental finance. So the value of C probably is going to increase with the increase in value of M. So this is sort of trying to bring the rationale and the context of why young people need to engage in climate and environmental finance. The institutional approach to supporting youth to access climate finance, enhancing transparency in youth climate finance flows. This particular section wants to highlight what why do we need an institution to support young people to access climate finance. I will skip right on to that. So why an independent fund institution, youth fund institution? At the Earth Summit or the Rio Conference of 1992, the international community recognized the effects of development on the environment. So it was agreed that parties would domestically mobilize 60% for financing at the national level, then the international community would mobilize the additional 40%. So this is the basis of co-financing. So this 40% would be mobilized, distributed, tracked, monitored, and evaluated by a facility. So this facility was called the Global Environmental Facility. Coming down to 2009 at the Copenhagen meeting, the international community that convened under the United Nations Framework on Climate Change set up an entity that would mobilize climate finance for climate action. This entity is today called the Globe Green Climate Fund, which has become the largest multilateral agency that supports climate change issues at global level. So it is basically serving the Paris Agreement, which is part of the greatest milestone in climate change policy negotiations at the global level. From these two pictures, it is evident it is only a facility or an institution that can be able to provide the right transparency, accountability, tracking, monitoring, review, basically in distribution and mobilization of climate financing for climate action and environmental issues. Over to the next slide. What are the pillars of the Independent Youth Fund institution? The Independent Youth Fund institution has six key pillars. The first pillar is the donor group, the second is the advisory committee group, the third is the global institutional overall, then the accredited entities, then implementing entities and executing entities. So who is the donor group? The donor group are agencies, organizations, individuals, governments that are willing to put resources basically to support youth agenda and youth financing at grassroots, subnational, national, regional and global level, those willing to support financially young people on climate change and climate action. Who is the advisory group? Advisory group are entities that have tend to understand the trends, the international and global trends, who are in a better position to advise the young people on basically how to better attract more financing, on how to engage on climate finance landscape. Basically, they can be entities that might have experience basically engaging, uh, accessing financing from some of the donor groups that are listed above. Sometimes you'd find some groups fall under both the donor and the advisory group. Then we'd have, of course, the Gycaf institutional oval. So when you think of an oval, this is the operating mechanism of the independent fund institution. It has two parts, the board and the secretariat. So the board represents young people from across the different the continents, the different regions. The secretariat facilitates the board and coordinates with other stakeholders such as the advisory committee and the donor group on how to uh, channel funding to the right projects and ensure implementation of the right particular project. So that would constitute part of the overall, basically, the secretariat and the board. The accredited entities. Who are the accredited entities? These are entities that ensure that the proposals, initiative, programs and projects that are presented, that are financed, that are funded align within the intergenerational aspect, the green growth aspect and the grassroots or locally led climate agenda. The intergenerational aspect because we need to ensure that we continue to define global climate finance as support given to the younger generation by the older generation to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So that aspect of intergenerationality must continue. So we need an agency that is consistently uh, has been in the system and is able to review and look at the intergenerational trends and movements of young people. Then, of course, we'd have the green growth people, agencies that look at the green growth agenda. So maybe a national government entities uh, who would support in this particular agenda. Then we'd have the grassroots and locally led agencies that look at the locally led and grassroots engagement of young people on climate change. Then, of course, we'd have the implementing entities. Who are the implementing entities? These are individuals, people, youth, NGOs, CSOs, youth groups seeking to access climate finance to improve their adaptation and mitigation initiatives and projects. So, anyone applying to get the funding from the institution, those would qualify as the implementing entities. Then we'd have the executing entities. Who are the executing entities? These are entities with experience in implementing projects and projects on the ground. So these executing entities basically would support the implementing entities during implementation of the projects, provide any technical support that they might and guidance that they might need towards implementation of this particular project. I will not talk about youth and uh, global youth organization engagement because this has been reserved for youth movement that discussions are already ongoing with uh, the institutional oval. So how does the oval? The oval has two parts, the secretariat and the board. So the secretariat is the technical machinery and the board is the political machinery, basically. So the board gets to approve which projects get funded and how much they get funded. The secretariat facilitates, looks at the make sure that the projects are realistic enough basically to be funded, and even within implementation they follow up to implementation to ensure that the projects, the resources, the money support provided is put into good use, and they coordinate of course with the advisory committee and the donor group through what we call the 25-step approach. So the work of the secretariat would be to sort of support intergenerational coordination and also intragenerational coordination and partnership to ensure that young people get access to climate carbon finance. So this is what we call the Gycaf institutional overhaul, and it seeks to go through the 25-step approach, which is form part of the direct access basically approach. This particular at the national level engagement, I will request to push it to the last three slides of my presentation. The 25-step approach. What is this 25-step approach basically? The 25-step approach is a communal approach that supports young people to access climate financing, basically for their climate adaptation and mitigation agenda. How does it operate? The Secretariat would receive the proposal from the proposed youth entity, then it would be reviewed by a regional coordinator, go under regional review, environmental review, and national country community review. Then it would be passed on to the board, basically, which would approve it. On approval by the board, it would go to the advisory committee if they have any advice on how best to implement this particular project or program, or if they have existing programs and projects that they might explore areas of collaboration and engagement with the specific implementing entity with the support of the institution. Then of course it would go to the board so that they would be able to look at also how the project would be best aligned to also meet their KPIs, because climate finance is not just given out like that. Then of course it would be taken to the project manager to look at the project logistics, and of course the finance manager who would approve funding for phase one. So after approval of phase one of the project funding, it will the monitoring and evaluation report, environmental report, and project officer report would be forwarded to the financial manager, of course. The first report for phase one, which would unlock funding for phase two, which would unlock funding for phase three, which would follow the same process. So for at the end of phase three, a report would be compiled for all the phases, phase one, phase two, phase three. This report presented to the board, to the advice, to the youth fund board, to the advisory committee, and of course at the end of the day to the donor group to basically see how this particular uh, whether the proposal has met the objective that it set out basically to implement, and explore possible ways of upscaling basically. What are the other programs that the institution is seeking to implement, because we know that not everyone has the capacity to develop a proposal. So other programs that have been designed by the Secretariat and are being looked to be implemented by the, of course, Secretariat are Adaptation for Green Jobs Program, the Youth for Green Growth Program, Tech and Innovation Hub Program, Mainstreaming S into County and Carbon Finance Program, Tracking of Climate Finance Flow Program. We will go through them one by one. So what is mainstreaming S into climate and carbon finance program? So S stands for Action for Climate Empowerment, and S has 6 key agenda items: education, training, capacity building, public awareness, public access to information, and international relations. So within this is the only engagement framework that young people have to engage meaningfully on climate change and carbon finance, on climate change issues basically. So what this program is looking to capacity building young people at the global level, subnational, regional level, subnational level, and grassroots level on climate change and carbon finance to create that sort of awareness and develop sort of an engagement framework for young people at all these particular levels. The Adaptation for Green Jobs program. What is the Adaptation for Green Jobs program? This program is targeted for young people in the developing countries. These include Africa, Asia, South America, and the likes. So the Adaptation for Green Jobs program is looking to create green jobs for young people through adaptation initiative, actions, programs, and projects, basically. So we're looking to promote adaptation because when you look at the target regions, the global south, let me call it as that, they're the most vulnerable, they're the least contributors to the effects of climate change, yet they're the most affected. And no one really wants to finance adaptation because we know that 93% of climate finance mobilized according to CPI report, that's Climate Policy Initiative Report 2017-2018, went to mitigation and less than 5 went to adaptation. So we're looking to promote more adaptation incentives, sort of incentivize adaptation through green jobs, basically for young people. So this is what the program entails. Then we have the Youth for Green Growth program. So what is the Youth for Green Growth program? The Youth for Green Growth program is looking to target the just transition, the low carbon pathway, low carbon pathway approach. So we look at the low carbon development approach. It is an approach that is looking to encourage parties, government, civil societies, all players to take a green growth approach, a low carbon approach, and this transition will need a bit of support. So this program is going to redefine basically the role of young people within this particular transition or within this particular pathway. So within this, what can young people do and how can they do it in a manner that will, of course, be able to support driving of green economies and green growth and the green agenda, basically. So it is targeted at not only the global south but also the global north because we know that even there are economies within the global north that uh, are have been using the unconventional uh, pathway or unconventional sources of energy that need to shift to cleaner and more uh, to cleaner sources of energy. So basically, this program would look to include young people in those in the global north, especially to support their governments, their communities, their companies, the private sectors, their parties, their countries, basically, to transit to a green and cleaner, low carbon development pathway. The Tech and Innovation Hub. So what is the Tech and Innovation Hub? Climate finance flows in three ways: capacity, technology, and partnerships. Capacity is within the mainstream of S into climate and carbon finance. Technology partnerships is enhanced through the 25-step approach. This is technology. What does the Tech and Innovation Hub entail? The Tech and Innovation Hub has three aspects: the research, the incubator, and the proposal development section. So the research is looking to finance young people to undertake research on climate change, in-depth research on climate change, that can be beneficial to local communities at the grassroots level. So this research would be financed, of course, through the institution, and this research would go into supporting local communities or local governments and contribute towards driving the climate change agenda because we know that we could not have the Paris Agreement without the IPCC reports. Then the incubator. So the incubator is looking to take up innovations, initiatives by young people, basically. So these initiatives that are going to be incubated to a level where they can be presented to donors, go through the full incubation process, be financed by the institution, as well as attract co-financing by entities outside of the institution, which the institution would be able to support basically, so that they could also, of course, develop their own companies or develop their own initiatives and yes, and stand on their own 2 feet and be be create an impact within the society. Proposal development. This is looking to train young people to develop bankable proposal that qualify for funding by various agencies and entities. This will ensure proposal can beat funding by both public and private sector. So bankable proposal basically means that they can be able to develop proposals that would, of course, uh, be able to be supported by the institution as well as other funding agencies. Then the tracking of climate finance flows. So when you look at one of the issues with climate finance in the table is the lack of a global definition of climate finance. The lack of a global definition of climate finance basically has resulted into the issue of double counting most of the time, because sometimes development aid is counted as climate finance. Donors don't know what people have different definitions of what they call climate finance, which vary, which makes it harder to track. So what this particular program is going to set up systems that are at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, county level, and community level, systems that could be able to track and monitor the flow of climate financing within within the different regions, within the different levels. So what are the existing climate change and climate finance mechanisms? So we have the coordinating mechanism, accounting mechanism, and financing mechanism. So what is the coordinating mechanism? Within the climate change engagement, the coordinating mechanism is called the UNFCCC. That's at the global level. At the regional level, we have regional bodies that try to coordinate, of course, engagement. Then we have national government coordinating at the national level. Then we have subnational governments or local governments coordinating at that level. Then we have community or ward administrators coordinating at the community at that particular level. So what are the accounting bodies? At the global level, we have the Green Climate Fund Board, Adaptation Fund Board, GEF Council. Then we have, of course, at a regional level, we might have the Committee of Africa Heads of State on Climate Change. Then we have the National Climate Change Council, giving Kenya as a case scenario. Then we have the County Climate Change Fund Board at the sub-national level. Then we have the World Climate Change Committees at the grassroots level. So what are the existing climate change and climate finance mechanisms? Financial mechanisms that exist are the GCF, the GEF, and the Adaptation Fund. Uh, then we have the Africa Climate Change Fund, which is a newly established fund, the National Climate Change Fund, the County Climate Change Fund, and the community funds, of course, which involve the financing locally climate action funds and the African Activist Climate Justice Funds, basically. So this is the existing climate change and climate finance mechanism. What is the proposed youth climate change and climate finance mechanism? We have the coordinating bodies. These are bodies that coordinate youth engagement, that we're looking to collaborate, for example, the Yungu or the International Youth Climate Movement, but we have others such as the IUCN Youth, WWF Youth, and other World Bank Youth that try to coordinate and grow at the global space. Then at the subnational level, we have, of course, at the regional level, we have organizations such as ICE, that's the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. We have GAIO, that is Green African Youth Organization, and YDS trying to coordinate at the regional level. Then, of course, we have the national youth climate change and environmental groups at each national, at every country has national youth organizations dealing with climate change. Then we have the subnational youth movement dealing with climate change. Then we have, of course, the grassroots or the local organizations dealing with coordinating young people at that particular level. What is the proposed financial body? So we have the Youth Fund Institution. Then, of course, we would propose for 5% of the Africa Climate Change Fund, then 2% of the National Climate Change Fund, 1% of the County Climate Change Fund, and of course the Youth Baraza grants. Then what are the accounting bodies? We'd have a board, the Youth Fund Board, of course, Then we have the Africa Regional Youth Climate Change Secretariat, then the National Youth Climate Change Councils, the county or subnational youth climate change councils, then we have the youth climate finance barazas, of course. And how would we harmonize this? There would need to be a partnership so that uh, the institution would co-finance 5% of the resources put under the Africa Climate Change Fund, 2% contributed under the National Climate Change Fund, 1% contributed under the County Climate Change Fund, and of course, fully finance the Youth Finance Baraza grants. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for your audience. I welcome you to share your feedback, share your comments. Our emails are always available online, or you could send us an email on our Gmail and we'd ensure that we get back to you. We'd like to hear thoughts. Thank you and have a good rest of the day or evening or morning. So, goodbye.